In a world where high-performance, zero-defect buildings are hard to find, two men are on a mission to disrupt the status quo. Welcome to the Edifice Complex, the property design and development podcast. Let your hosts Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean keep you up with who is innovating and doing great work, perspective on the adjacent possible, and challenges to the status quo.
Welcome to the Edifice Complex. I'm Robert Bean, your co-host and unofficial mediator, here with my colleague and official agitator, friend, and Yoda of most everything to do with buildings, Mr. Adam Muggleton. Say hello, Sir Yoda.
Hello there. Yes, I am the agitator against the status quo, the angry old man. I used to be an angry young man. Now I'm an angry old man. How about that?
So for today's episode, we're continuing our discussion on sustainability, but we're going to throw in a whole bunch of stuff that revolves around that. And if we get a chance, we're going to talk about ethics and engineering in that world of sustainability with our special guest, Roland Clift, who's a chemical engineer who helped develop the new discipline of industrial ecology. Roland, welcome to the show.
Hi. Hello. I'm another grumpy old man, by the way.
You're in good company.
I get what confidence I have in the future from the younger people I work with.
And I'm going to become the most perfect grumpy old man because I get to have two grumpy old men today to work with.
Yeah.
So, Roland, you have a really interesting career that, of course, sort of has a base in the UK, but your voice is heard internationally, both in the world of academia, but also in the world of engineering. So maybe you could tell our audience, just share with them your story. How did you get to be who you are?
Oh, okay. Well, I started out as a fairly conventional chemical engineer. Okay, first degree at Cambridge, PhD at McGill. So I'm actually joint British and Canadian citizen. And I got interested originally in fluid particle systems. I started working on aspects of the clean coal technology that was being developed in the 1970s. And then leading on from that, I was asked to head up a national research initiative in the UK on clean technology. That involved, it was an interesting proposition. It involved, basically, I was given a sheet of paper with clean technology written at the top of it and asked to fill it in. So I got to define what clean technology is. And the more I got into that, I managed to get the way the research funding was divided up in the UK in those days, it was very much divided up on disciplinary lines. And with a bit of effort, I managed to get several of the research councils involved. So that was engineering, biological sciences, and social sciences, all involved in this initiative. Because the further I got into it, the more I realized that the environmental problems that we've imposed on the planet are not a result of lack of technology. They're a result of lack of intelligence in using technology which we already have.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, well said. Well said, yes.
Yeah. I gave up the job I had as head of the chemical engineering department at the University of Surrey in the UK. And instead at Surrey, I set up a centre which was intended to bring together engineers and social scientists.
All right. I like that.
This was in the early 90s, around the time of the first Rio conference, when things like that were a bit loony. But time proved that I was right, actually. This was needed.
That sounds like a good Venn diagram.
Well, exactly. What is now called the Centre for Environment and Sustainability was started out as observing that, by and large, there's a field called socio-technical studies, and it really doesn't work because the socio people don't understand the technology, and the technological people don't understand the social sciences. So I was consciously trying to put a bridge in there. So that's where I came from. From that, I got into developing ideas on sustainability. I got into things which are a bit foreign to a lot of engineers, including the agenda which is called post-normal science.
Wow, I like that.
It's the idea, it came from Jerry Ravets and Silvio Funtovich. And the idea is that when you have something which is really important, but where the data and background information is extremely uncertain, then you need to have what the post-normal scientists call an extended peer community. So things like planning and technical decisions need to be exposed to public debate to make sure that they really have incorporated the wishes of the people who are going to be affected by whatever you're doing.
So as you said that, as you were saying that, what came into my head is climate change. This is exactly what's going on, right? Unsettled science,
Absolutely.
Angry people,
Yep.
Them versus us, I'm right, you're wrong. And where's the public good coming out of this?
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's the big headline example where post-normal science is needed. Now, you can find other things like urban air quality, which has come onto the agenda in more recent times, but that's exactly the kind of problem where the post-normal science is actually rather important.
So let's bring in the dismal science of economics. Do they get involved here with externalities and real cost of?
Over the years, I've found that the hardest discipline to involve is economics.
Because it's dismal.
Because particularly neoclassical economics. I mean,
Right.
I realized somewhere along the line that neoclassical economics is like Euclidean geometry. There are a few basic axioms, and the whole thing is then built as a marvelous logical structure on the basis of 4 or 5 axioms, some of which are manifestly nonsense. And that makes it very difficult to debate with neoclassical economists, because you can't sort of criticize a bit over here without criticizing the axioms.
It's the left hand and on the right hand, So we should probably leave the...
That's getting better. There's ecological economics developing, which is really rather more grounded, actually. But over the years, I would say the economists have been the ones I've had most problem with, and I am really not a fan of the approach of financial valuation, internalizing the externalities. I think it's a false concept, actually. One of the reasons is that it tries to reduce everything to a single dimension called value.
Yeah.
And the economic concept of value is very different from the philosophical concept of value. So I've tended to try. Most environmental economics and philosophy is based on utilitarianism.
Right.
The idea that it's for the maximum good of the maximum number of people.
Yep.
That's behind things like cost-benefit analysis. I think that's actually gone in the wrong direction. I'm much more interested in trying to base environmental thinking on Kantian ethics.
Right.
The idea of a categorical imperative. Something which, if everybody did it, we'd all be okay, putting it crudely. And that, I think, is the way you head on climate change, rather than internalizing the externalities.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see this if you look at the Stern report, for example, if you remember that a few years ago.
That rings a bell, actually. I can't remember it, though.
But it was probably about 10 years ago now. It was a report done by a very eminent economist on climate change. It had a lot of resonance in Europe because he was an economist.
Right.
He actually took a lot of scenarios, some of which I'd developed, although you wouldn't know that from the Stern report. I don't mind that, but what he did was cost what was necessary to follow those scenarios to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And he concluded that the cost of following a low carbon path was small compared to the cost of the damage caused by climate change.
Right.
That's interesting.
Now, that got a lot of attention at the time. It was one of the things that persuaded a lot of European governments to take climate change more seriously. But it also told you an enormous amount about the economic community, because the economists said, oh, well, his conclusions are wrong because he used the wrong discount rate. And if you used a more realistic discount rate, you concluded that it was okay to defer action.
Yeah, this is short-term versus long-term thinking.
Yeah, that's
it
really is.
This is just, it tells you more about economists than anything. To be fair, one of the people who was most critical, an economist by the name of Nordhaus at Yale, he has since recanted and said, look, we got it wrong.
I'm sure that wasn't on CNN.
Really, having admitted that.
Yeah.
The same philosophy occurs.
Imperative. It says you don't pay great attention to the discount rate. You say, well, what have we actually got to do to save the planet?
Right. If you look at it from the social sciences, it's like when you have people that have let's take mental illnesses, for example, and that once they get into the system, now they're on the system. And of course, that has to be funded. But if you treat them before they develop the mental illness and all of that occurs, then the economic cost to society is way, way lower. I mean, we need to prevent them from getting into the system, keep them off the system. And of course, everybody benefits. They benefit, their families benefit, society benefits. And it's the same thing that we're talking about here.
Exactly. And if you go back to what I was doing on clean technology when I was heading the UK initiative on that, it was exactly that approach. You don't go for a cleanup. You go for getting it right in the first.
Right.
Okay, that's the basis of clean technology.
Right.
Yeah, this is where, if you think in systems though, right, when you're doing cleanup rather than prevention, there's job creation, there's a system becomes, it wants to defend itself. I'll give you an example. So one of the greatest opposers of legalization of marijuana in America are the prison unions.
Yes.
Because half the prison population is there for weed, right? So, the system, the prison union system has to defend itself, even if it's against the greater good or the prevention of, right? That's the same thing we got going here with climate change. There are systems in place like the coal production system, for example, right? That has an interest in survival.
Yeah.
Right? There is.
Yeah. Where do you guys think?
The oil sands. I mean, how on earth did we get into that?
Moolah, money.
Well, to my undying shame, I actually did some consultancy work for Syncrude in the 90s. Because it was a typical engineering mistake, okay? It was a technologically interesting problem.
Yeah.
It was about how you design slurry transport pipelines. And I didn't at the time think about whether this was the right thing to be doing.
Yeah, because it was just interesting.
We look for solutions within the boundary conditions and we don't question the boundaries.
So that is a great segue to ethics, right? Ethics in what we do, engineering society, where... This is where, for me, I studied systems thinking at university. It was just one of the courses I did because I like bubbles on paper. But when you the systems are about where you draw the boundary, right? Yeah. So, for you, that technical problem was so interesting. That was your boundary. But when you didn't step back and come out. So when we look at sustainability, low carbon agendas, everybody would agree that if you draw the system around the planet Earth, we all want our children to live well and have no food and water stress, right? But when you start getting it down to the subsystems, have to defend themselves, that's when it all goes a bit wrong. So this is where ethics comes in, right?
That's right. So, but let me just say something before we get into that.
Yeah.
One of my continuing concerns about engineers is that we don't actually, enough of the time, take that system view.
Yes, agreed.
So we end up working on more efficient ways to do things that we should not be doing.
Correct. Yes. I can agree more.
Me working with Syncrude is an example of that, actually.
Yeah, because engineers are fundamentally problem solvers, and I'm not going to knock them for narrow thinking, but there is a resolution of thinking that is immediate to the problem in front of you, right? It's unusual to step back and look at the inter-system connections there, certainly in buildings, for sure.
Yeah.
Roland, I mean, one of the lectures that I heard, and you were talking, I think it was at Oxford, and it was a lecture on sustainability, but you did introduce an ethic discussion, and it had to do with engineers working under the Nazi regime.
Oh, yeah.
And I was drawn to that discussion, because it's an incredibly difficult discussion to bridge, and you did a masterful job of doing that. But it opened my eyes as a practitioner to try to put myself in the engineer's seat, where I was asked to design an oven or some horrific mechanical system or thermal system,
which was of Auschwitz.
Right. And so how did those engineers, how do you even ethically and morally face those kinds of problems? So can you talk about that lecture a little bit?
Okay. I think we can distance ourselves a bit from what happened in the 1940s, but not too much. I mean, one of the things which the Nuremberg trials established is that it isn't a defense to say I was only following instructions or taking orders. And I think you have to apply that in your everyday engineering life.
Yes.
Okay? Just because your employer or the client tells you to do something that doesn't remove the responsibility to ask, should I be doing this? And if not, then you have to refuse to do it. Now, that for people working under the Nazi regime, that may be particularly difficult, but we're not under that sort of regime. And we do have choices, and you can't duck that one.
Agreed.
So if you're asked to do something as an engineer, and you know that this is going to have negative impacts on people, maybe even a lot of people, then you've got to say no. And I think we are actually getting better at that. Now, some of the companies I worked with, I particularly work with companies in what's called fast-moving consumer goods, FMCGs. So that's things like personal care products and food. A lot of the companies in that sector are starting to get the plot. And what I also find is that when I talk to people at a sort of lower level, the level on which I work with routinely, they've got it. They know that they are trying to do better, and that's better in an ethical sense. What I find particularly frustrating is that that ethos within the company very often doesn't get declared in public. And when I ask why, I'm usually told it's because the stock market doesn't like it. The share value will go down if the stock market thinks that we aren't totally focused on making a profit.
That's interesting.
I'll give you an example which I'll keep anonymous for these purposes. Big FMCG company was subject to a takeover bid recently. We had been doing some work with them. We were about to put out a press release on the work we've been doing with them. And because of this takeover bid, we were told they could not be named in the press release.
I think I know who that is, actually. I'm a big fan of the stock market.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That is really interesting.
But it's pretty short-sighted, I think.
So are you saying that consumers don't put a value on it, or just the stock market? Do you think consumers?
No, I'm saying the stock market is seen as being a barrier.
Right.
To be honest, I'm not one of these people who thinks that everything rests on the consumer. I think consumer influence is, well, less than some people would like to claim.
That's interesting.
And personally, when I look back at what I've done over the years, I've been involved with a lot of sort of government advisory bodies. One of the things that strikes me is that the things I've done which have had the most impact have been with companies, not governments. So I think it's our role, the role of people like you and me, to actually get into companies and influence their thinking. That's really the pressure point. And the thing that pushed me to that finding was, I do a lot of work in Sweden. I'm a visiting professor at one of the Swedish universities, Chalmers. Sweden has, around the world, probably the highest record of consumers buying environmentally labeled products. And Statistics Sweden estimates that this affects something like 2% of consumer purchases.
That's interesting.
Okay, and that's one of the world leaders.
So do you think that is...
Oh, boy.
So that's higher than others. Is that...
That's high,
Yeah.
and 2% is relatively high. And the reason it's that high in Sweden is that for example, supermarkets compete on their environmental credentials. So people don't actually look at the labels. There's lots of evidence that if you ask people in the street, are you going to buy an environmentally friendly product? Of course they're going to say yes.
Yeah.
But when you follow them around the supermarket, they don't even look at the labels. And so in Sweden, it's determined by which supermarket you go to. So the supermarkets compete with environmental credentials to get people to go in there.
So the marketing mix includes environmental credentialing.
Yeah.
Which effectively creates a culture of buying environmental products. So the marketing leads the culture rather than culture leading the...
Yes.
No, that's interesting.
Yes.
That is interesting.
And that's enforced not by selective individual consumer purchases, but by where the consumers go to make the purchases.
That's interesting, because that gives me hope that you can generate that interest with marketing, because that means you can spread that virally almost, right?
Yes.
That's really interesting perspective.
I may be being naively optimistic, but I think I can see signs of that knocking over into the construction sector.
Yes.
Okay, some of the companies I work with have decided that they're going to, for example, follow the FSC, the Forest Certification Council, in their sourcing, even though the customers don't require them to.
Yes.
It's a statement of company ethics and policy. And that will have this sort of effect of improving the culture.
So let me ask both of you this question. I mean, when you look at the traditional method of building buildings, it follows sort of a segregated design structure. So in other words, the client works with the architect and all of the professionals are kept away from each other, lest they collaborate and come up with a really good idea.
Yeah.
Right? Forbid. Heaven forbid, right? But by keeping the professionals isolated and not collaborating, to many ways, you're preventing them sort of to create a basket weave of their own ethics and morals. So can we challenge owners and architects about these systems, and are they unethical systems?
Some of them are. Some of them are certainly unethical. Yes, and we can challenge them, and I think we need to. And that actually, I think you can see two different approaches. I'm really looking at this now more from the UK perspective than a Canadian perspective. FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, that was a bottom-up initiative. If you remember how it came about, a lot of companies all the way along the supply chain, all the way through the supply network, were frustrated that there was no agreement reached on forest maintenance in the Rio conference in 1992. So separately, a lot of non-profits, supply companies, forest management companies came together and set up the FSC. So it's an interesting example of a bottom-up exercise, and that has actually had quite a lot of traction in that part of the sector. Then against that, you have top-down initiatives like the Modern Slavery Acts, the movement against modern slavery. That's imposed from above.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that at least so far, it's had much less impact because it's imposed. It hasn't grown up and therefore penetrated the ethos of the whole supply network.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not organic, basically, is it?
In many ways, it's much like subsidies in solar systems, for example. They're short-lived. They last as long as the subsidy or someone's paying attention. But when you have it from a grassroots level, like Passive House, for example, or some of these other high-performance building programs that started much more conservatively at the bottom and have just started to blossom.
Yes.
And I think that's quite powerful.
That's right. I think it's much more powerful than, well, most other mechanisms I can think of. The downside, where you have to be careful, is that things like passive housing, some of the examples I've seen, particularly in Sweden, now to have a passive house in Sweden is actually quite an achievement given the climate, but because there isn't a really well-developed structure, you can see mistakes. Like there's one near Gothenburg where the houses themselves are designed really very imaginatively for energy efficiency, but it's nowhere near public transport. And when you work out how much diesel or gasoline people use in driving around, it more than outweighs the effectiveness of the building.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
Which is why you need this systems view.
Right, yeah.
Mistakes like
Right. So as what you're talking about, Adam, when you're looking at defining the problem as one small bubble, but outside of that bubble is a much bigger challenge with much more impact. And that's a great example, Roland. That's, Well,
this is the Venn diagram of life, right? So if you can get people, buildings, the built environment, and transportation systems to cross somewhere, that's the sweet spot, right?
Yeah, that's it.
This is the argument for master planning.
Yeah. That three-lobe Venn diagram that I and a lot of people use to explain sustainability.
Yeah.
That diagram is widely used, but a lot of people misunderstand it. So let me try and explain it. What that diagram tries to represent is decision spaces.
Right.
Okay. So if you take, for example, the environmental or ecological space, that says that is supposed to describe the range of things we can do and remain consistent with the long-term health of the biosphere. Then you've got the technical, techno-economic efficiency circle down to the left.
Yeah.
That's what is perceived to be viable under the current economic system. And one of the reasons I make that distinction is, and here's an aphorism which plays well in China: the laws of thermodynamics are carved into stone, the laws of economics are written on paper.
Correct.
And so, you can you can move around the techno-economic lobe by, for example, changing the fiscal structure.
Yes.
And in fact, what's happening in Canada now, I don't know if you're aware of this, is really an extraordinarily interesting experiment. When you look at the different approaches to carbon pricing, the different provinces, the way that's going to play out is going to tell a lot of people how to move in future.
Yes, because this is what I didn't understand when I moved to Canada. It's not really one big country. It's about 10 countries loosely bolted together under one flag, right? So everyone's sailing their own ship or trying to. That's interesting.
That's why I find BC particularly interesting, actually. I mean, for rather weird political reasons, BC's got into putting carbon pricing on at a level which in Europe is considered to be politically unacceptable.
Yeah, they're doing it. Yeah.
So the way that's working out is pretty interesting. And then, follow on with what other provinces are doing. So you've got ways of moving around that techno-economic lobe. For example, one of the things which I think I hope we'll see more of is you have to be quite clear that no one is advocating extra taxes.
Yes.
We're advocating a shift, revenue neutral shift, away from taxing labor towards taxing non-renewable resources.
I agree with that.
And if you get that one right, that will encourage the circular economy idea, which is labor intensive.
There's political risk with that approach, though, because governments are great at introducing taxes, but they're not good at reducing or taking them away, right? So what you wind up with is budget deficits everywhere, which we have.
Yeah.
So any new money grab isn't a money grab, and there's never the opposing cancellation of something else, right, to make up for it.
I think, that was what tripped the whole thing up in Australia particularly.
Yeah.
It amazed me that they didn't emphasize this point about revenue neutrality.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the problem, right? You get politicians involved who are short-term thinkers at best, and it becomes problematic. So the political dimension is a factor here, unfortunately.
It's a huge factor.
That's not a reason to give up on it.
No, it's not.
It's pretty important. Okay, and then the other, if we get back to the Venn diagram, the other lobe is the societal one. And that's where the ethical principles really come in, because that's saying that we have an ethical imperative, really, to provide a good quality of life for everybody now and in the future. It goes back to the Brundtland definition. So that's where futurity comes in. Well, you mentioned grandchildren already. I've got a grandson. Yeah. And I need to be able to look him in the face and say, look, I tried.
Yeah.
I may have left you a mess, but I did try.
Yeah.
So I think you can't duck that ethical dimension of it. We have responsibilities. Now, ethics is basically about your responsibilities to other people.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment. If you're enjoying this podcast, we need your help. We're not asking for money, just a minute of your time. Our goal is to make the Edifice Complex podcast as relevant, educational, and useful as possible. By having good ratings, we can reach the widest audience. Therefore, our request is two small things. If you haven't already, leave us a review and rating on iTunes. And subscribe to the Edifice Complex on YouTube, even if you normally only listen to the audio version. These two things will help us immensely. Also, if you would like Robert or Adam to speak, teach, or consult on your project or business, please email admin@edificecomplexpodcast.com. Thanks for your time, and now back to the show.
So I hate seeing politicians argue about climate change. It's like seeing two bald guys argue over a hairbrush. It's a misdirection, in my opinion, because you can just go down one layer in that system and agree on just about everything, like pollution, plastic in the oceans, right? So, I actually, when I thought that through, I believe the public have the power here to affect the politicians. So, for example, if we just stopped buying plastic bottled water, what would happen? A lot would happen, because it's scalable and the business would immediately respond, and so would politicians by default, right? So, somehow, if a mass movement that doesn't look like the Green Taliban trying to invade everyone, just people choosing not to do something but to do something else, that is where you could get immediate mass change. How do you get that message out? I don't know. It's like the marketing in Sweden to get people to buy ethical goods.
Oh, no, maybe there's some positive signs. See, I think, I agree with you entirely with all that. But it has to be done at a more local level.
Yeah.
That's what's wrong with things like the Paris Agreement.
Right, I was going to come on to that, yeah. So what do you think of that?
It was important that there was an agreement.
Yeah.
But what's actually in the agreement doesn't matter a whole lot.
Well said.
Particularly because it's voluntary. So the fact of Trump pulling out, maybe that won't matter too much. Politically, it matters. He's made a huge mistake. It enables China to occupy the high ground, but that was just silly. But I'm in Vancouver right now. And, for example, the city of Vancouver has got a public campaign on telling people not to buy bottled water, drink tap water.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, why have we not got that in Ontario?
And it seems to be getting a lot of traction. Now that's that sort of thing which is needed.
Yeah.
There was a statement that came out today from Architecture 2030 that with or without Trump, the U.S. is already on track to meet or exceed the agreements that were made with the Paris Agreement years ago. And you see that in local municipal governments and local and even the federal governments at state level have said with or without them, we're making commitments to these reductions.
Yeah.
So I think again that goes back to this grassroots is more powerful than the top down.
Yeah.
And so you may not agree with Trump and what he's done. Ultimately, I think what you're right, Roland, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Legacy.
Yeah.
But that's why, again, I'm agreeing with you forcibly. When I, look back at the stuff I've been involved with over the last 20 or 30 years, the most effective stuff has been done with companies and local organizations, not national governments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a libertarian, I suppose. I'm a libertarian who believes in social medicine, so I'm an oxymoron. But, when you look at it, right, you see people say, evil companies, and some of them are. But, if you go back 20, 30 years and look at the companies around then, Kodak is a good example. They're not around now, right? So there is Darwinism in that. You tell me how many government departments have been shut in the last 20 or 30 years. No, right? So this is the problem. Yeah. I think industry and the private sector can come up with solutions. It's the politics and the messaging that gets wrapped around it. Sometimes it gets a bit backwards, right? So, if you could get what they're doing in BC, just a straightforward advert, you don't need to buy a bottle of water. Drink the tap water, right? What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine, yes. No, what the best you can do with governments, I think, is make sure they don't do anything completely perverse.
Yeah.
Because the action and the change is not going to come at national or even provincial government level. It's going to be smaller scale and commercial companies.
Roland, you realize it's hard enough for me to sleep at night. Now I got to go to bed thinking I have to prevent them from doing perverse things. I'm not sure I'm up to that challenge.
When you get to our age, it's easier. One of the nice things about being retired is that you don't need to give a toss. Actually, so my wife's threatening to buy me. There's a book apparently being published called something like the liberating power of not giving a shit.
That would be a great tagline. 0 F's given. FYI. I mean, it's good we can laugh at this, but these are big issues, right? And I actually
huge issues.
But it comes back to this one. You've got to be able to look your children and grandchildren in the face.
Yeah, it does.
That's, to me, that's what's behind the ethical thinking. It's I've had discussions with various people who think that ethics is a branch of religious studies. It isn't.
It isn't at all.
It isn't. It's a branch of philosophy, and it has to do with being able to look your children in the face.
Yeah. So the question that sort of comes to my mind is, when does it become ethically unacceptable to build an average crappy building that's going to emit or it's going to perform poorly for 25, 50 years, right? We must be getting close to that point.
Yeah, we are. And that imposes really some quite difficult personal ethical questions, I think.
Yeah.
Because if it's really bad, do you say, I'm not having anything to do with this? Or do you stay in there and try to make it less bad?
Yeah.
That's the engineering professional judgment.
It is actually, yeah.
And I don't think there aren't any universal answers to that one. It's the only, you've got to ask, can I look myself straight in the face in the mirror and say, I actually did my best with that one, and it would have been worse if I hadn't been around?
So when I look back on...
that's a good thing.
When I was at Cobalt Engineering, it was a M&E design firm. So I had a guy there, and he just did not want to work on condos. So when I asked him why, he says, I want to work... We had a lead platinum job in the office. He said, I want to work on that. That matters. So he was already exercising. This was 10 years ago. He was probably doing it because for career as well. I don't want to be stuck in a condo sector. I want to work in the sexy sector, and I get that. But there was also an element of that was ethical, right? I don't want to be part of that rubbish anymore. I want to be part of this new thing that's trying to do something. And
I think that's a valid decision.
Yeah.
What goes with that is you've actually got to be clear and articulate and say why you want that.
It's the why. Okay? The why matters, right?
Why, yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that engaged me over the years is what is actually the social role of an engineer? And the one I've come down to is a definition of a technical expert as what I call an honest broker.
Right.
Okay. And your job, and this fits with the post-normal science idea, your job is not to make decisions for people. Your job is to make sure that the decisions are made in full cognizance of their implications. So your job as a technical expert is to say, these are the considerations, these things should guide your decision. But then you have a role in the decision as a member of the general public, but not as an expert. Your expert role is to make sure that all the relevant information is made available and is considered in making the decision.
Yes.
And that puts I think that's a more manageable goal for engineers too.
This is where the engineering institutions need to sort of rethink things, because they always talk about public health and safety, which is a duty of care for all engineers. But you're right. Yeah. It's a bigger topic than that. Yeah. Right?
Yes. And looking at the sort of whole picture, whole system approach, that's an important part of what the engineers have to do.
Yeah.
Because, you can't expect politicians, members of the general public, to understand that, for example, if you buy a particular piece of timber for your building and it hasn't got FSC certification, you're contributing to deforestation.
Yeah.
As a very obvious example, you can find plenty of others.
Yeah. So that requires us to take a real look at engineering education because, Adam, on the show, we've talked several times now about exergy efficiency as opposed to energy efficiency. So, we teach engineers that energy efficiency is good. So they come out of mechanical engineering school, they go work for a manufacturer, they produce a combustion device that might hit 97, 98% combustion efficiency, but an exergy efficiency, it might be 6%.
Yes.
Yeah. And they're not aware even.
And they're not even aware of it. There's a total ignorance about that. So bringing that back to sustainability and the discussion of philosophy and ethics, you gray-haired guys, I'm working on it. I think we have an obligation then to bring this awareness to the colleges, because if we don't, then we're sustaining ignorance is what we're doing within the engineering community.
Yeah. I agree with you. Now, you mentioned earlier on, right back at the beginning, industrial ecology.
Yes.
And the reason I think that's important, industrial ecology is a grouping of what have traditionally been separate disciplines. It's engineering, systems thinking, thermodynamics. It's also a bit of ecological awareness, a bit of social science, and that means understanding questions like, how do people form their views? It's not surveys, it's understanding what causes views to be formed. Yeah. And of course, some economics. Because I think increasingly we have to be able to challenge conventional economics on its home ground.
Agreed. Economics is dangerous because they put numbers in and it gives the perception of reality when it's about as far from reality as you can get.
Yes, right. I think all engineers should be made aware of, it's a technical detail in economics, but it's pretty significant. And in my experience, economists don't like you to know about it. It's the Kaldor-Hicks compensation test without compensation. And if you find it in an economics book, it's roughly this. If you're trying to work out whether a policy change or a business change is to be made, and there are two groups of people, one of whom suffer and one of whom benefit, as long as the people who benefit have a bigger benefit than the loss of the people who suffer, then according to the Kaldor-Hicks test without compensation, you should do that. Now, those provided the people who benefit more than the people who are screwed get screwed. That's to be...
Yeah, sucks if you're being screwed though, right?
And that follows from utilitarian ethics, of course.
Yes.
But I think it's pretty untenable, actually.
Yeah.
That's where I started to move sideways into Kantian ethics.
Yeah. That's almost a good analogy for what's going on in the world today, the disparity in wealth and the haves and have-nots, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. We're almost at a tipping point. We're at a tipping point nearly.
Yeah.
So just to take it back a little bit, I was talking about energy modelling, right? Do you know what the dismal science of economics? You know what the dismal science is in buildings? Energy modelling. People think that thing is just like the truth, right? And I'm seriously thinking about getting a energy modeler on a podcast because, basically I say to people, it's about 50-60% science, about 40% art.
Yes.
And it's all down to the guy or gal who's interpreting and trying to wrangle that model to work, right? Yes. And tick a box. And people get these modelling results and go, oh, that's it. It's good. It's going to be that way. Yeah. This is why there's lawsuits in the US about lead performance of buildings, right?
Is there? Okay.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's because we've known for a long time that, buildings as designed, buildings as built, and buildings as occupied are three different things.
Three different planets, pretty much.
And you know that the energy performance of a building has at least as much to do with the way it's used.
Yes.
As it had with the way it's designed.
Yeah.
So why don't we pay more attention to building operation?
Yeah.
And that means taking a much long... It's where the discounting bit comes in again.
Yes.
Take a long-term view.
Yeah.
And being criticised for using too low a discount rate means you probably got it right, actually. Low discount rate, right.
Probably, yeah. Probably. Yeah, there's nothing more intimidating or powerful to convince people than a big NP, net present value spreadsheet, right? You put the spreadsheet up and there's gazillion cells and everyone goes, oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And it comes down to like the discount rate probably being the key variable in all of it, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, you say, and it'll be in a corner somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, which is some guy's judgment ultimately.
So the challenge in that is that when you start to talk about how buildings are operated, now you're starting to talk about human behavior, and human behavior is not in building codes. So there's a complete disconnect about what we use to build buildings and how they're actually operated. And so as long as we use building codes to design and construct buildings, we'll never solve the problem.
No.
We have to introduce the human factor into it.
Agreed.
Yeah, and that's true. Even as I said, I spend quite a lot of time in Sweden, and that's even true there. Now, Sweden is interesting because if you want to make a comparison, I describe Canada to my Swedish friends as Sweden without the dogma. The Swedish society is extraordinarily dogmatic.
Right.
And there are terrific pressures on people in Sweden to behave in a consistent kind of way. And even with those Swedish social pressures, they still have some difficulty in getting people to behave in a responsible way in buildings. Now, I'll give you a specific example. I've got a small apartment in Gothenburg, which is where I stay when I'm in Sweden. In the winter, I have to turn the radiators off because otherwise I get so much heat from the apartments either side because they've set their thermostats to 25.
Yep.
And I get so much heat through the internal walls that I can't keep my apartment down below 20, which is where I like it to be, except by turning off the central heating.
That's crazy.
And that's there's an example, even with social pressure in Sweden. They can't get people to turn their thermostats down.
Yeah. So great story to this. There's a guy that I communicate with on Twitter, and he's from Bangkok. And he keeps his air conditioning off because both sides on either side of him have their cooling set so low that it cools the walls. Right? It's the same but reversed, right?
Same thing. Yeah.
So the smart people figure that out.
Yeah.
It's a good example of radiant heating and cooling, right?
Absolutely.
If ever you wanted one.
Yeah.
Okay, listen, guys, we're coming up on 45 minutes. I'd just like to get into some final thoughts with everyone. So, Roland, if you could say, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, it's a big thing, but, if you could change three things to make a difference, what would they be? Oh, gosh.
I would have, looking ahead, back to something I said earlier on, the reason I can sleep at night is that I have some wonderful people I've had as students who are out there making a difference.
Right.
And that's my hope for the future. So my first big thing will be education. Yeah. And I put industrial ecology into engineering programs.
That's interesting.
Because it covers all these things: systems thinking, ethics, environmental concerns, exergy analysis, actually. Okay, so that will be my number one for the future. Better education, particularly for engineers, and industrial ecology is the route to doing that. It does. The way I explain industrial ecology, by the way, to my chemical engineering colleagues is to say chemical engineering is about managing the flows of materials and energy inside process plant. Industrial ecology is about doing that in the economy.
That's interesting. I like that analogy.
It's chemical engineering inside the pipe.
Yeah.
So that's my number one. My number two would have to be changing the stranglehold that economics has on public policy, and particularly the short-termism that comes from the emphasis on discount rates.
Yes.
Give you an example. Work I've done with various companies in the electronics sector is apparently not economic to recover scarce metals from old mobile telephones.
What, even the rare earth metals?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's insane. It's insane. So, and this is due to discount rate. So one of my thoughts is what would happen if sovereign wealth funds, Norway, for example, said, this is crazy. We're going to put some of our money into buying old mobile phones and just keeping them in a warehouse until the economic switch is and the price of the scarce metals goes up, which it will do.
I like where you're going there, because that's like an arbitrage move, right?
Yeah. It's saying, discounting is crazy. Yeah. How can we do well, by ignoring it, actually. Yeah. And so at some point in the future, I don't know when it will be, common sense will break through even into the economic sphere. And scarce metals will become more valuable again. So
you're basically saying there could be an unintended outbreak of common sense in a corporation at some point in the future. Yes. Yeah.
And then I guess my third thing would be to hope that the financial markets, the investment sector, would take a longer term view.
Yeah.
It is just, the short-termism of the investment sector is something that seriously worries me.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. So that just leads me on to one other question, actually, because I'm an investor myself. I manage my own pension fund, and I'm very keen on the infrastructure funds that are pursuing the P3, just because I'm a big fan of reliable streams of income as I get older.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that happens to you when you get older, right? Yeah. So do you see like the advent of P3 and the infrastructure funds around them as a good thing? Do you see that as a positive?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so do I.
I've followed the same approach as you.
Right.
I had some involvement with the investment. I was a director of an investment fund for a while.
Right.
And not long after getting into this, I realized that these people actually don't understand systems.
Right.
And they don't understand the system they're investing in. So I actually sold all my equities and bought property and works of art.
Hard assets. That's one of the things I'm pursuing, actually.
The sculpture is a considerably nicer thing to have than a share certificate.
Yeah.
And we've got various properties like you as investments, generate a rental income.
Yeah. So just for our listeners here, if you want to understand where we're going with this, look into what happened in Cyprus a few years ago. That'll tell you everything you need to know about your investing future. And I'll say no more than that, because this isn't that type of podcast. But I know it. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. That's great. Well, I think we've covered everything I wanted to cover. I mean, I was really interested in the ethics discussion, and that did not disappoint. I have to tell you, I got some good thoughts coming off that. I can feel some blog posts percolating in my head already, actually. So, Robert, any final questions?
Yeah, when can we get Roland back on again?
Yeah, I think we might have to have a part 2 on this next year, Roland, when you get back from your winter hibernation.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's nice to talk to you guys. Hope people find it. Well, I hope people find things in it which are both entertaining and provoking.
Oh, they will. The mission is to provoke thought and try and generate change, and I think we've touched on that pretty much all the way through this. Yeah,
for of course the listening audience, we're just recording the audio portion, but of course we're all on Skype, and so there's a visual communication going on between the three of us. And I can tell you that looking into Roland's eyes when he says, "I want to be able to sit and look at my grandkids and tell them I did the best that I could do," that was touching. Because there was sincerity in that, but there's a huge message in that, and thinking about tomorrow's generation. So that was powerful.
I thought that was a great, great interview.
I'm really glad that we got to talk to him. You don't get to talk to these people often, right? Because they're all over the world. And, he's in Sweden, he's in the UK, and he's now moving to Canada. But as he travels around the world, he's taken with him a knowledge that is just phenomenal. I mean, he's got such wisdom about ecological systems and economic systems. And, there's so much an engineer can learn from him. Yeah, this is where you realize the tunnel vision that is engineering education, right? Yeah. Because, just the industrial ecology and that great definition he gave of it being, the convergence of different disciplines, adjacent disciplines, trying to understand each other and what's going on around them, right? That just doesn't happen in my world of engineering. Yeah, mine neither. And the other thing that he made, when you asked him about the 3 things that he can change, and all 3 of them were really quite good. Yeah. But I was moved by the part 1. But number 2, changing the economic stranglehold and the short-term views that economics has. We really need to do that. I don't know how we can emphasize that enough, how economics is screwing us, and I say us, the world, by economic policies, the short-term view. Now, he was right to focus on the discount rate, or the internal rate of return, as it's sometimes called, because that number, I don't care what anyone says, that is a guess, right? Yeah, it is absolutely, it's a guess. People will give you this long dissertation about why it should be 6 or 7%, but you know what? It's a guess. And it's normally given, I think, when you work for government. They'll say, right, well, you got to work around this internal rate of return to meet our standard, blah, blah, blah. So, you're hobbled from the start sometimes. But the ethics was a really interesting conversation. Yeah, it sure was. I love that, as an engineer, the reference to Nuremberg trial was brilliant. It is a legal precedent that is not sufficient to say for anything, including killing someone. I was following orders. You will be held accountable at some point. Yeah. Right? So I'm not saying engineers are killing people, but there is a choice, right? You can choose not to work on shitty things. You can leave that firm. You can go into an adjacent field, right? You don't have to produce crappy condos, right? Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's probably, and I don't know now where they teaching ethics and engineering, but I got to think that it should be one of the very first year, second year courses. Yeah. And in fact, you know what? Maybe it should be a course every year, just to keep reminding them, because ultimately what happens to people, and it becomes an economic thing that, engineers take on positions. They're like everybody else. They're trying to feed their family. They're putting their kids through school. They need to deal with transportation, all of these types of things. And so you can get faced with decisions that affect your personal economics, and having to say no means that you could lose your job. And are you prepared as an engineer to walk away from those bad things? Because if you're not prepared to walk away, you maybe want to be thinking about a different profession. Yeah. And so that's why I'm saying that they need to teach ethics at the beginning of a curriculum. They do, yeah. Yeah. Because it's easy for you and I, we're mature, we're older, we're established. When you're in the middle of your working life, it's hard because you've got children and mortgage, right? So as you say, if you get this thinking done while you're learning in the junior part of your career, where you've got the option to make a choice easier, that's the time to do it, right? Yeah. I'll never forget the time that we're bidding on a project. It was a large district energy project, and the engineer of record on the project had said to us that in the event that we were successful in our submission, that a certain amount of the money needed to be transferred to his house personally. Now, this occurred to us during a downturn in the economy. And I remember having the discussion with my advisors. I was totally taken about having been asked that. I just couldn't believe, and this was a professional engineer, that a professional engineer would ask such a question. And of course, then the second thing that occurs to you when you're doing that is that this person needs to be reported, right? Because that's that's one of the obligations that we have. And then the third thing had to do with my sort of the long-term view is that in the event that if someone's faced with that decision, if you accept that term, then you will always be labeled as somebody who can be bought.
Yeah.
You could never erase that from your character trait.
Nope.
You could try, but you can't.
You've got to look at yourself every morning in the mirror when you shave, right? And, that will haunt you. Even if you think it won't as a young person, when you get older, I can guarantee you it will, right? These things don't go away. That guy was brazen, right? Yeah. I guess he was just so brazen he caught you off. No. He caught you off guard, did he? Yeah.
Totally. Who would ever expect that a professional would require that from, so I will never forget that for as long as I live. And of course, the decision is very clear for somebody who is ethical. No. Yeah. And we pulled our bid.
Yeah. You can't get in them games because that's a zero-sum game. Ultimately, you wind up down a barrel of badness.
Yeah. But that was what Roland was saying is that when you're faced with decisions, you have to say no.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether it's something that's going to affect one person or a number of people or the biosphere or your own character.
Yeah, again, the way to wrap this up is CEO I used to work with at a firm, he was really good. He was a great communicator. He's the sort of guy that could fire someone and they'd leave his office going, thanks, that was awesome. He was that level of Jedi Knight, right? But one of his great sayings is, be a leader, you've got to be comfortable with the word no.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to say it and live with it.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where a lot of junior managers fail. They are yes people, right? They want to yes and please people. And there comes a point when you become a senior manager and leader where you have to learn to deal with the word no and deliver it and receive it.
Yeah.
And if you're a Jedi Knight, you can fire people and they will thank you. And I have personally seen that happen. This guy was at another level, so I won't name him. I won't blow too much smoke up his bottom, but he was pretty awesome.
Wonderful.
So, okay, that was a great interview. I'm looking forward to the next one, so I'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Adam.
You've been listening to the Edifice Complex podcast with Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean. To access show notes for this episode, visit edificecomplexpodcast.com. Also, if you would like Robert or Adam to speak, teach, or consult on your project or business, please email admin@edificecomplexpodcast.com. See you next time.